The dust settled in the same way it always did, a fine red powder coating the sweat on the men who failed. From his vantage point on the low rise overlooking the valley, Cole had watched it happen a dozen times, maybe more. The ritual was unchanging. A rider, full of bluster and whiskey-fueled confidence, would swagger into the corral. The woman, a slash of defiant red against the muted browns of the landscape, would watch with an unreadable stillness. And the horse, a creature of midnight and fury, would do the rest. Today it was a man named Hank, a ranch hand from the south with arms like fence posts and a laugh that scraped the air. He lasted longer than most, a full 8 seconds of violent, bone-jarring chaos before he was thrown, landing with a grunt that echoed in the sudden silence. The black stallion's shadow circled him once, nostrils flaring, a victorious snort ripping from its chest, before trotting to the far side of the corral, its coat gleaming like wet obsidian under the punishing summer sun. The woman, May, did not move. She stood by the gate, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The silk of her red cheongsam, embroidered with golden peonies, seemed to shimmer with a heat of its own, a stark and impossible flower blooming in the harshness of the west. She never flinched, never offered a word of comfort or scorn. She simply waited for the man to pick himself up, brush the failure from his denims, and leave. Cole shifted his weight, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. He wasn't here for the spectacle, not really. The other men who came to watch from the surrounding hills were here for the thrill of the fall, for the gossip it would generate at the saloon later. They talked about the Chinese widow and her impossible challenge as if she were a puzzle or a prize. They speculated on her motives, her wealth, her grief for the husband who had built this ranch before a fever took him a year prior. Cole heard the whispers, the crude jokes, but he saw something else. He saw the way her hands, though steady, were clenched so tight the knuckles were white. He saw the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her jaw when the stallion bucked. He saw that this wasn't a game to her. It was a vigil. He turned his own horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, away from the scene and started the slow ride back to his own property, a modest spread of land that bordered hers to the north. The image of her, solitary and unyielding in her crimson dress, stayed with him. It was the color of courage, he thought, but also the color of a wound that refused to heal. Each man who tried and failed was another stitch in that wound, proving a point only she seemed to understand, that what was lost could never be replaced, not by force, not by arrogance, and not by any man who saw the horse as just a beast to be broken. His own ranch was a quiet affair, a testament to solitude and hard work. The small cabin was sturdy, the fences were mended, and his small herd of cattle was healthy. It was a life of routines dictated by the sun and the seasons, a life that had suited him since he'd left a different world behind years ago. Yet the silence had grown heavier lately. It was a silence that the lowing of cattle and the nicker of his horse could no longer fill. That was why he found himself riding to the ridge overlooking her property more often than he cared to admit. He told himself it was to keep an eye on his northern fence line, but he knew that was a lie. He was drawn to the quiet drama unfolding in her corral, to the fierce loyalty of a woman who would rather face the scorn of an entire county than let the memory of her husband be dishonored. Chin, her husband, had been a good man. Cole had known him only briefly, a few shared words over a stray calf, but he had recognized a similar quietness in him, a strength that didn't need to announce itself. He had seen the way Chin handled the stallion, not with a whip or a harsh word, but with a murmur and a gentle hand. The horse was not wild, not truly. It was grieving, same as the woman. And every loud, aggressive man who tried to conquer it only reminded it of the master it had lost. One afternoon, instead of just watching from the ridge, he rode down. He didn't go to the main house or the corral. He went to the small creek that snaked between their properties, a place he knew she visited to gather water for her garden. He dismounted and let Buck drink, his eyes scanning the cottonwoods that lined the bank. He didn't have to wait long. She came walking down the well-worn path, carrying 2 wooden buckets. She moved with a liquid grace that seemed at odds with the harsh land, the red dress a silent declaration against the dusty greens and browns. She stopped when she saw him, her body going rigid. She did not look frightened, but guarded, a fortress preparing for a siege. He gave a slow, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. She watched him for a long moment, her dark eyes assessing him, taking in his worn clothes, his calm demeanor, the way his hands rested easily at his sides, not near a weapon. She gave a nod in return, so slight it was barely a movement. She said nothing. She walked to the creek, filled her buckets, and turned to leave, the heavy load seeming to weigh nothing in her steady hands. As she passed him, he spoke again, his voice quiet enough not to startle. "He's a beautiful animal," he said, not looking at her, but toward her ranch, as if the horse itself were visible from there. She paused. He could feel her gaze on the side of his face. "He was my husband's," she replied, her voice soft but clear, each word carrying the weight of a stone. Then she was gone, the flash of red disappearing up the path, leaving Cole alone with the sound of the creek in the heavy summer air. He started making the creek a regular stop. He would time his visits for the late afternoon, when the heat began to break and she would come for water. He never approached her directly, never pressed for conversation. Sometimes he would be mending a piece of his tack. Other times he would simply sit with his back against a cottonwood, watching the water flow. He was a silent presence, a part of the landscape she slowly began to accept. She no longer stiffened when she saw him. The slight nod of greeting became a constant. One day, a week after their first brief exchange, he was tightening a strap on his saddle when she set her buckets down and walked toward him. "You do not come to ride," she stated. It was not a question. "No, ma'am," Cole answered, looking up at her. Her face, even in the dappled shade, was striking, etched with a sorrow that only made her beauty more profound. "Why do you watch?" she asked, her gaze direct, unflinching. He thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He wanted to tell her he saw her pain, that he understood the ritual, but the words felt too intimate, too presumptuous. "I watch the horse," he said instead. "He reminds me of one I knew a long time ago. Proud, loyal, only answers to a soft hand." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps understanding, crossed her features. "The men who come," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "they have only hard hands." She picked up her buckets and left, but this time the space between them felt different. It was no longer a divide, but a shared silence, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that needed no further explanation. The parade of hopefuls continued, but Cole stopped watching from the ridge. He heard the stories in town, of course. A blacksmith from Coulter Creek who'd been thrown so hard he'd lost 2 teeth. A young farmhand who had wept with frustration after being bucked off in under 3 seconds. The challenge had become a local legend, and May's legend grew with it. The woman in red who guarded her dead husband's horse like a dragon guarding treasure. Cole ignored the talk. His interactions with May by the creek became the new routine. They were still brief, still weighted with unspoken things. He learned that her garden was a struggle against the dry soil, that she missed the taste of the mooncakes her mother used to make. She learned that he preferred the quiet of his ranch to the noise of the town, that he knew the names of the wildflowers that grew in the shade of the rocks. He never asked about her husband, and she never asked about his past. Their conversations were built around the present, small and fragile things that could exist in the space they had created. One afternoon he brought her a small sack. "For your garden," he said simply. Inside was rich, dark soil he had hauled from a fertile patch near his own cabin. She looked from the sack to his face, her eyes wide with a surprise that softened the guarded lines around them. "There is no need," she began, but her voice was uncertain. A soft hand isn't just for horses, he said, his gaze gentle. Sometimes the earth needs it too. He began leaving the sacks of soil by the creek for her, and in return he would sometimes find a small bundle of fresh vegetables waiting for him, wrapped in a clean cloth. It was a silent barter, an exchange that went deeper than soil and produce. It was a gesture of trust. He found himself thinking of her not just as the woman in red, but as May. He savored the sound of her name, a name he had only heard others speak. In his mind it sounded like the single, clear note of a bell. He saw the toll the challenge was taking on her. The dark circles under her eyes were more pronounced. The stillness she projected at the corral was costing her something vital. It was an armor that grew heavier each day. He also saw the toll it was taking on Shadow. The stallion was becoming more agitated, more aggressive with each new rider. The horse wasn't just defending a memory. It was being forced to relive a trauma over and over. The animal's spirit, the very thing she was trying to protect, was being eroded by the endless fight. The loyal, proud creature was being turned into a monster, one failed rider at a time. Cole knew something had to change. The vigil had become a cage, for her and for the horse. But he also knew he couldn't just tell her that. The walls she had built around her heart were too high for mere words to scale. The day he decided to ride was quiet. There was no challenger scheduled, no crowd of spectators gathering on the hills. A soft haze hung over the valley, blurring the sharp edges of the landscape. He rode not to the creek, but directly to her gate. She was there, sweeping the porch, not in the red Cheong Sam, but in a simple dark blue tunic and trousers. The change was so startling that for a moment he could only stare. Without the defiant crimson, she looked smaller, more vulnerable. She looked like a woman, not a symbol. She saw him approach, and her hand tightened on the broom. A familiar guardedness returned to her eyes. He dismounted slowly, letting the reins drop. Buck stood ground-hitched, placid as ever. "Cole," she said, her voice barely audible. It was the first time she had used his name. "May," he replied, the name a strange and wonderful thing on his tongue. He walked toward the corral, his steps measured and calm. Shadow was standing near the water trough, head low. The horse looked tired. "I've come to ride the horse," he said, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement of fact. He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw none of the arrogance or bravado of the others. She saw only a quiet resolve, and something else, a deep, resonant sadness that mirrored her own. She studied his face, searching for the trick, the angle, the hidden pride. She found none. She only saw a man who looked as weary of the fight as she was. She gave a single sharp nod, her throat too tight to speak. She walked to the gate and unlatched it, swinging it open for him. The vigil was about to end, one way or another. He didn't walk straight to the horse. He entered the corral and closed the gate softly behind him, then leaned against the fence, his arms resting on the top rail. He simply stood there, a silent figure in the large, dusty enclosure. Shadow watched him, ears twitching, muscles tense. The stallion expected a fight, a rope, a loud voice. Cole offered none of it. He just stood, patient and still, letting the horse get used to his presence, his scent, the calm energy he projected. He was not a threat. He was just a man, sharing the same space, breathing the same air. After a long time he began to speak, his voice a low murmur, not much louder than the buzz of insects in the afternoon heat. He didn't speak to May, who watched from the porch, her hands clenched in the fabric of her tunic. He spoke to the horse. "Easy now, boy," he said. "No one's going to hurt you. It's a long time to be so angry." He talked about nothing in particular, the heat of the day, the way the clouds were building in the west, the solid feel of the earth beneath his boots. He spoke of his own horse, Buck, of the simple trust between them. He wasn't trying to command or cajole. He was just filling the silence with peace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to leave the stallion's body. An ear swiveled in his direction. The tail, once rigid, gave a soft flick. May watched, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had seen dozens of men try to tame Shadow with force. She had watched them try to outmuscle him, to outyell him, to break his spirit. This was different. This man was trying to understand him. He was speaking the language Chin had spoken, a language of patience and respect. After nearly an hour, Cole pushed away from the fence and walked slowly toward the center of the corral. He didn't look at Shadow directly, but moved on a gentle, circling path, never making a sudden move. The horse watched him, wary but not panicked. Cole stopped a few feet away and crouched down, running a hand through the dust, letting it sift through his fingers. He stayed there, making himself small, non-threatening. Shadow took a hesitant step toward him, then another. The horse lowered its massive head, nostrils flaring, and sniffed at Cole's outstretched hand. Cole didn't move. He let the horse investigate, let it learn that his hand was not a fist, that it held no malice. Finally, after a moment that stretched into eternity, he slowly, carefully rose to his feet. He reached out and laid his hand on the stallion's powerful neck. The horse flinched but did not pull away. Cole began to stroke the sleek black coat, his touch firm but gentle, his low voice a constant, soothing murmur. "There now," he whispered. "You remember this, don't you? You remember a soft hand." He spent another half hour just standing with the horse, his hand moving in long, calming strokes along its neck and back, speaking to it in that same quiet voice. He found the places where tension was knotted in the muscles and worked on them with a slow, steady pressure. He was asking for permission, not demanding submission. When he finally gathered the worn leather reins that hung on the fence post, he showed them to Shadow, letting the horse smell them before he gently slipped them over its head. There was no fight. He didn't use a saddle. Like Chin, he would ride bareback. May held her breath, a hand pressed to her mouth. This was the moment. Every other man had rushed this part, eager to prove his dominance. Cole moved with the unhurried grace of a man who had all the time in the world. He placed a hand on the stallion's withers, put his foot on the horse's side, and swung himself up onto the broad, powerful back. For a single, heart-stopping second, the horse tensed, its body coiling like a spring. May braced herself for the explosion, for the violent bucking that had thrown every other man. But it didn't come. Cole sat easily, his body relaxed, his weight balanced. He didn't pull on the reins or dig his heels in. He just sat, letting the horse feel his presence, his trust. He leaned forward and whispered something into the stallion's ear, a secret shared between them. Then he gently squeezed with his legs, and Shadow moved. It wasn't a lunge or a bolt. It was a smooth, powerful walk. Cole guided him around the perimeter of the corral, once, twice. The horse moved with a collected energy, a contained power that was no longer directed by rage. It was responding to the quiet guidance of the man on its back. Cole urged him into a trot, then a canter. They moved together, a single fluid entity, man and horse in a silent, perfect dance. They were not conqueror and conquered. They were partners. Watching from the porch, May felt the armor she had worn for a year finally crack. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, then another. It wasn't a victory she was witnessing. It was a release. The horse was not being broken. It was being healed. The challenge, the endless, painful test, was over. Cole had not won by being a better rider or a stronger man. He had won by being a kinder one. He had honored the memory of her husband not by trying to replace him, but by understanding the spirit he had so loved. He rode Shadow for a few more minutes, then brought him to a gentle stop in the center of the corral and slid to the ground. He gave the stallion a final, fond pat on the neck before leading him to the water trough. He stood and watched the horse drink, his back to her. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It wasn't empty or tense. It was full. It was peaceful. May walked down from the porch, her steps unsteady. She stopped at the corral gate, her hand resting on the warm wood. Cole turned to face her. His expression was calm, his eyes holding a deep well of empathy. There was no triumph in his face, only a quiet, shared sorrow and a profound respect. He had not come to claim a prize. He had come to answer a call for help that she had never known how to voice. She couldn't find the words to thank him, to explain the knot of grief and fury and loyalty that had been strangling her for so long. All she could do was look at him, her eyes conveying everything her voice could not. He seemed to understand. He gave her a small, sad smile and a nod, as if to say, "It's all right." He started to turn, to get his horse and leave, to give her the space she needed. "Wait," she said, her voice raspy. He stopped. She opened the gate and stepped inside the corral. She walked not to him, but to Shadow, and laid a trembling hand on the horse's neck, right where Cole's had been. The horse, usually so wary of her touch since Chin's death, leaned into her, nudging her shoulder with its head. The tears came freely now, silent drops of rain on the parched ground of her grief. "Thank you," she whispered, the words meant for him, for the horse, for the memory of her husband. Cole simply stood there, a patient witness, giving her the dignity of her sorrow without trying to fix it or fill the silence with empty platitudes. He understood that some wounds needed to be washed clean before they could begin to heal. When her tears subsided, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him, a fragile strength returning to her eyes. "My husband, Chin, he would have liked you," she said. "He was a quiet man, too." Cole nodded. "I know. I met him once. He had a good hand with a stray calf." A faint smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it transformed her face, letting a light shine through the cracks in her grief. "He loved this ranch," she said, her gaze sweeping over the dusty corral, the small house, the vast, empty land beyond. "He built it all. He said this land had a strong heart." "It does," Cole agreed. "You have to be strong to survive out here." His words hung in the air, an acknowledgment of her own resilience, her own quiet fight. She looked down at her simple blue tunic, then back at him. The red dress felt like a lifetime ago, a costume from a play that had finally ended. Would you stay for some tea?" she asked, the invitation both a peace offering and a tentative step into a new, uncertain future. "I would like that very much," Cole said, his voice soft. He followed her out of the corral, leaving Shadow to stand peacefully by the trough. Inside her small, tidy home, the scent of dried herbs and jasmine hung in the air. It was a place of quiet order, a sanctuary she had fiercely protected. As she prepared the tea, her movements were graceful and sure. They sat at a small wooden table, the silence comfortable now, companionable. The story of the challenge, of the 100 failed men, felt distant, like a fever dream that had finally broken. They didn't talk much as they drank the tea. They spoke of the coming rain, of the way the light changed on the mountains at sunset, of the small, ordinary things that made up a life. He learned that the peonies embroidered on her red dress were her mother's favorite flower. She learned that he had a small collection of books he read over and over. They were discovering the people they were behind the roles they had been playing, the grieving widow, the lone rancher. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Cole knew it was time to leave. He stood, and she walked with him to the door. "You will come back?" she asked, her voice quiet, hopeful. "If you'll have me," he replied, "but not to ride the horse." A real smile, brighter this time, reached her eyes. "No," she said, "not to ride the horse." He mounted Buck and tipped his hat to her. He rode away not as a victor, but as a neighbor, a friend. As he crested the ridge, he looked back. She was still standing on the porch, a small figure in blue, watching him go. And in the pasture beyond the corral, the black stallion was running, not with the frantic energy of a captive, but with the joyful, powerful grace of a creature that was finally free. His visits became a new routine, replacing the old one of watching from the ridge. He would ride over in the late afternoons, after his own chores were done. Sometimes he would help her mend a fence or clear stones from her struggling garden. Other times they would simply sit on the porch and drink tea, watching the changing colors of the sky. He never wore the red dress again. She packed it away carefully in a wooden chest, along with the life it represented. Her daily attire was now the simple, practical clothing of a woman who worked the land. The change was more than just sartorial. It was a softening, a slow unfurling of petals that had been closed tight for too long. She began to smile more, to laugh at his dry, understated humor. He, in turn, found the silence of his own cabin less oppressive. The quiet was no longer empty. It was filled with the anticipation of their next meeting, the memory of her voice, the light in her eyes. He learned the story of her journey from a distant land, of the arranged marriage to Chin that had unexpectedly blossomed into deep love and respect. She learned of the family he had lost to sickness back east, the tragedy that had driven him west in search of a place where the memories wouldn't crowd him so. They were two solitary souls who had been shaped by loss, and in each other they found a quiet harbor, a place where their scars were not things to be hidden, but to be understood. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Shadow trotted up to the fence, resting his head on the top rail as if to listen. Cole reached over and stroked the horse's nose. "He seems calmer now," May said. "He is," Cole replied. "He knows he's home. He knows he's safe." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "We all need that." The unspoken words hung in the warm air between them. They were no longer just talking about the horse. The ranch, once a monument to her grief, was slowly becoming a home again. Her garden, nurtured by the good soil he brought and her own patient hands, was beginning to thrive. Small green shoots pushed through the earth, promises of life and renewal. They were small victories, but they were victories nonetheless. Cole found himself looking forward to the future for the first time in years, a future that was not defined by what he had lost, but by what he was slowly, carefully beginning to build. Their connection wasn't one of fiery passion or grand declarations. It was a quiet, sturdy thing, built on a foundation of shared silence, mutual respect, and the gentle healing of time. It was like the land itself, harsh and demanding on the surface, but with a deep, resilient heart. They were two broken things that, side by side, were beginning to feel whole again. The legend of the Chinese widow and her impossible challenge faded into town memory, replaced by the simple, observable truth of the quiet rancher who came to visit her every day, not as a conqueror, but as a companion on a long road home.